Possibly some of the most well-known words in all of Scripture go like this. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. And this was the first census that took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Now, we hear those words, and many of us hear them over and over around Christmas time. In fact, if I had to guess, most of us, whether we've been in church all our lives or if this is our first time in church, we've probably heard those words somewhere. If nothing else, maybe from Linus around Christmas time. What's interesting, though, for us is we kind of get to breeze through those couple of verses. They're kind of little markers for us. They help historians know exactly when it was that Jesus was born. They have all kinds of fun debates and arguments about it. But that's for us today. For the people who lived that life, for the people who were alive at that time, those words were anything but just a casual sentence that could be easily thrown away. They were impactful. In fact, there was one guy who was a part of that census. The census itself was not just so Rome knew how many people were around. It had a deeper purpose than that. If you're a government and you take a census, the basic idea is you know how many people are around, so you know how much tax you can get from a certain area. And this was Rome's idea. If we know how many people live here, then we know how much to tax them. And there was a guy, his name was Judas. He goes today, we call him Judas the Galilean. And Judas lived at a time, he was actually older than Jesus, but he lived around the same time. And Judas lived up around the Sea of Galilee, the northern part of what is modern day Israel. And when Judas heard about this census, dude lost his mind. He went crazy. He started ranting about how wrong this was, how unfair this was, how horrible it was that Rome was doing this. And so he began to get people around whom had the same belief system that he did. He was so angry they started a little revolution. They tried to go toe-to-toe against Rome. And as they tried to go toe-to-toe against Rome, they found themselves, sort of defeated, sort of quickly. You see, I say sort of because in some ways, Judas never really went away. His memory it stirred the hearts of certain people. In fact, what Judas had founded, this Judas the Galilean, he founded a movement that went way beyond his lifetime. You see, up until that time, there were three different philosophies, three different ways of being a Jew. You could be, if you were a Jew, you could be a Pharisee. Maybe we've heard of these people. Pharisees were those who said, okay, we don't like this. We don't like the way the world is. We don't like the Romans. But what we're going to do is we're going to work really hard at trying to obey the law. And if we work really hard at it, we believe that God will send someone to get rid of the Romans. And so with everything in us, we're going to try really hard to obey the law. That's what the Pharisees did. There was another group called the Sadducees, and the Sadducees, their way of going through life was different. They said, well, here's the deal. Right now, Rome is big and strong, and we're puny and tiny, and they're a really massive empire. And so instead of trying to get them overthrown, what we'll do is we'll just be Jewish, but we'll be Jewish and we'll be really agreeable. We'll try to use the Roman law to our advantage. Which is what they did. And maybe you've heard of these types of people before. There were two big groups of people, and Jesus interacted with them quite a bit during his ministry. And the Sadducees are where all the priests and the really uppity sorts of people were. They were the really rich Jews. There was a third group called the Essenes, and the Essenes said, forget it, we're getting out of here. And they went and they lived out in in what we would think of as monasteries or convents way out in the middle of nowhere. They would move all the way out and they'd be like, Rome can have that part. We're going to be out here in this section of the world where the Rome doesn't even care about this place because it's such an awful place and it's so hard to live out here. This is where we will live. Some people think John the Baptist was an Essene. So up until Judas the Galilean, there was 3 ways you could be a Jew. But the historian Josephus tells us that Judas the Galilean started a 4th way, a 4th philosophy of Judaism. It outlived him. The philosophy was this. They called themselves the Sicarii. And what the Sicarii would do is they believed in overthrowing the Romans, but they thought that God might need some help. And so the Sicarii, they became known as Sicarii because of the long, thin knives they would carry around with them. They would walk through town. There was nothing you could do to really tell them apart, but they would walk through town. They began to look for Roman soldiers that ventured away from the group, and they would assassinate them. They knew that if we go toe-to-toe with Rome, if we fight a war on Rome's terms, we will lose. But if we find ways to participate in guerrilla warfare, in fact, we today would call it terrorism if we're being honest. If we find ways to act and fight back in these ways, then we can overthrow Rome. And so the Sicarii began to get more and more powerful. In fact, they went so far as to not just attack the Romans themselves or Roman sympathizers, but when the census came out, Judas the Galilean actually said it was a sin to pay the Roman tax, and he and his followers would at times actually murder and assassinate Jews who agreed to pay the tax. This was the world that Jesus was born into. In fact, Josephus, the historian, would later lay the blame for the Jewish-Roman war that absolutely ended the temple and all those things. He would lay it at the feet of Judas the Galilean in his 4th way. And you might say, well, Brian, that's a fun history lesson, but why does it matter? Because you've taken a few minutes of my time and you haven't told me why these crazy knife-wielding Sicarii people actually matter to me. And you're right, I haven't. The reason that we're talking about the Sicarii is because they have another name. They don't just go by the Sicarii, but they're also called the Zealots. And we're going to encounter one of them today. If you have your Bibles, I want to invite you to open up to the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And we're going to pick up, some of you, if this is your first time with us, how we do this on Sunday morning is we just take the next passage. We work verse by verse, passage by passage through, at this point, the Gospel of Luke. And so we've been doing this now for a few months. We've been going through Luke, and we're taking our time. We're not getting in a hurry. We're just taking our time and saying, okay, what is it that's going on in the life of Jesus? And the way that Luke records it, how can we see what God's doing in and through Jesus, and how can we understand how that affects our lives today? Luke chapter 6, verse 12 is where we're going to pick up this morning. And here's what Luke writes. One of those days, Jesus went on a mountainside to pray. And he spent the night praying to God. And when morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Now, at first glance, we take a look at this, and when you just read through it, there's a part of us that it looks almost like a list of names for a substitute teacher who's taking roll, doesn't it? It's almost like Jesus is like, hey, I'm going to be gone for the day. Here, go ahead and take over, and you just make sure all the people are present, right? And at first, it kind of has that feeling to it. But what's more interesting, when we look at these lists of names, it's very interesting to pause for a moment and think about the people who get listed. What's happening here, Jesus has a bunch of disciples. Rabbis in that day would have a group of disciples, think like Mother Duck and her ducklings behind her, right? You have the rabbi who's going along, and behind the rabbi are a bunch of people kind of following along, a group of people who are trying to understand who the rabbi is, what the rabbi does. They're watching everything Jesus does, and they're trying to understand why Jesus does what he does so that they can do the things that Jesus does. They want to do what Jesus does because they know what he knows, because they see what he sees. This is the idea of being a disciple. And so there's this point, Jesus, Luke tells us, goes out and he spends all night praying. And when he comes back from praying, he calls all the disciples and goes, okay, now look, you guys are all wonderful and you're all special, but there's 12 of you who are like going to become part of the inner group. And this really does make a lot of sense when you think about it. If you have hundreds of people, it's tough for any person to have like really good connections with hundreds and hundreds of people. But Jesus goes like, I'm going to pick 12 of you. And these 12 people, Jesus is going to pour his life into. And then we get the list of names. And at first glance, again, we go, well, okay, 12 people. Why does it matter? Until you think about what we know about these people. And think about it for a second. Peter. Maybe I haven't thought about it very much, but Peter is the favorite of the apostles for us pastors to pick on. And maybe you've heard a few sermons on Peter, but the thing with Peter is this, like Peter has a lot of low-hanging fruit. You can look at Peter's life and feel better about yourself anytime you want to. In fact, if you're ever having a bad day, open up the Gospels and read about Peter. Because you are almost certainly going to find a passage where Peter messes up. All you have to do is look for Peter, and it's 95% that passage he's messed up somehow. I mean, even Peter's great moments, walking on the water, what does he do? He walks on the water for a little bit, and then he goes, ooh, waves, and sinks when he's this far from Jesus. You know, dude, like, you made it from the boat to Jesus, and when you got by Jesus, then you decided to sink? Come on. Like, Peter's that guy. Peter's the guy who has really bad foot and mouth. You know what I'm talking about? Like the person that they just opened their mouth, and whatever comes out of their mouth was probably best left unsaid. You guys know those people? By the way, if you don't know those people, it might be you. But we all have those people, right? Like, and that's Peter. Like, Peter's that guy who, like, every time he talks, you're like, oh, can't wait to see what this idiot says this time. Like, every time. And that's Peter. And Peter gets listed first. I mean, in John's gospel, Jesus goes to the cross, goes to the empty grave, right? And Jesus comes out of the grave, conquers death. And you know what Peter does? Peter's response is, I'm going fishing. And completely walks away and runs back to his fishing boat. Which is the wrong thing to do. Like, I mean, if you're Peter, the guy just won. It's not the time to give up and run away, which is what Peter does. Like, Peter's always doing the thing that you're not supposed to do. That's Peter. And Peter's the first on the list. It doesn't get better. I mean, we don't have time to go through all of them, but just to track down the list a little bit, like James and John, there's a bunch of winners right there. I mean, yes, John wrote a book later on, which we have that one. But let's not think too highly of John for a minute. There's a point that Jesus is walking down the road. He has these 12 guys with him. And as he's walking, there's the idea that's starting to get developed that he's going to start a new kingdom. And all the disciples are going, oh, this is awesome. Like, Jesus is going to be the king. And then James and John start thinking, well, like, you know something. I mean, every king needs a cabinet, right? How cool would that be? And they start running in their minds about how cool it'd be to be part of the cabinet. And then one of them, I don't know which one, it was probably John. I don't know. But one of them looks at the other and goes, you know something? There's different jobs in the cabinet, and some are better than others. Like, no one wants to be Secretary of Education, right? Secretary of the Interior? Like, what's up with that? Everyone's going to be Secretary of State, Secretary of War, like, right? And so Vice President even, that'd be awesome. And so James and John start discussing, like, how can we make sure that we get the really good seats? And then, like any adult would do? They go to Jesus and say, Jesus, hey, by the way, we have a question. Could we talk about your cabinet? And some of you are giggling because you know the story. That's not what they do. Like any good adult does, they pick up the phone and call mommy. Yeah, that's the right response. They call mommy and they go, hey, mom, can you help us? We want to get the good seats in the cabinet. And their mom actually comes and talks to Jesus like, hey, Jesus, look, when you establish your kingdom, can one of my boys sit at your right and one of my boys sit at your left? You know, like the really good seats. And then they're dumbfounded when everyone gets mad at them. Like really low emotional intelligence here. And that's not it. Like, that's James and John 1. The other thing, I love this story. Jesus walking down the road, and some Samaritans are less than polite. And James and John go, ooh, Jesus, do you want us to call down fire from heaven? We'll burn up those towns. We can do it. It's going to be awesome. A couple things about that just impressed me. One, as you read about Jesus, what part of Jesus' ministry makes you think he needs help with miracles? I mean, Jesus pretty much has a handle on this miracle thing, right? Like, this is the dude who, like, looks out at a storm on the Sea of Galilee and goes, hey, shh, and everything goes dead calm. Jesus is the one who's like, hey, everyone's hungry, and feeds like thousands of people with like 5 loaves, 2 fish. 15,000 people get fed. There is nothing that Jesus needs help with. Jesus doesn't need help. If Jesus wants to burn up some towns, he can do it all on his own. He doesn't need special James and John to help him. But beyond that, these guys are following Jesus around like, just to take a poll here, how many of you think that Jesus came down, entered into our world to just incinerate everybody who didn't believe in him? Yep, pretty much. You guys are good. Like, there's nothing in Jesus' ministry that would indicate his response to people not doing what he wants them to do is like, and you get some fire, and you get some fire. Like, that's nowhere in what Jesus does. And here James and John like, man, they didn't say please and thank you, Jesus. Let's burn them up. I find this wildly amusing. Some of you don't seem to find this as amusing. Don't worry, it'll be okay. We won't like critique all of the apostles. We only have 4 more to go. So, yeah, I mean, it's not just, these are the guys, right? And like every one of them, like think of Thomas. Like if you know who Thomas is, it probably is associated with a single word. What's the word we associate with Thomas? I mean, how would you like for the next 2,000 years someone to know you by a single word? You know, doubting. That one person who saw Jesus and goes, I don't know, you're a bit too real. That's Thomas. And then you have people like Matthew. Matthew is an actual tax collector. That's where he comes from. This is the dude who's on Rome's side. In this incredible amount of tension where everyone hates each other, like Matthew's the one who's on Rome's side, who's like born with a silver spoon in his mouth, is going collecting all the money from the people he went to school with to give it to Rome. And at the same time he's there, there's a dude named Simon who is all about killing the people who gave money to Matthew. I mean, that's got to be great for like company picnics, huh? And there's times, right, when you sit there and you go like, man, like, Jesus, what were you thinking? It's almost like, you know when you were a kid and you were in school and everyone's going to play dodgeball or kickball or whatever, right? And you pick 2 captains and the captains pick their teams and there's always like the one kid that both the captains are like, I don't want him, you take him. That was me, by the way. I was that kid, right? But there's always that one kid that like nobody wants, right? It's almost like Jesus was like at school and got stuck with all the kids that nobody wanted. Like, they're not that impressive. I mean, at the end of the list, you still get Judas, like the one who betrays Jesus. You still get that one. And he makes the list. And here's the interesting part to me about this is all written down Like, decades after it happened. Here's what I mean. Luke wasn't there. Luke is collecting stories decades after Jesus is already gone back in heaven. Luke is collecting stories, and Luke is writing it down then, which means it's not as though he didn't know what would happen. Like, Luke knew when Luke wrote Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him, he knew exactly what was going to happen. When Luke writes, like, oh yeah, Simon was part of the group, he already knows all about Simon's mess. Like, Luke is literally writing these names with full knowledge of what's wrong with these guys. And they still get in the book. Here's the part that impresses me about this. As we look at the early church and read through Scripture, it's not hard to dig up dirt on these guys. They are a motley crew of misfits. They just are. And what's interesting is this, like, even though these are the people who first meet the resurrected Jesus, they're the ones, like this group of apostles, you add Paul into this mix, and this group of apostles, they're the ones that are responsible for carrying out the message of Jesus. They're the ones that are in charge of the early church. They're the ones that are writing the New Testament. That's these guys. And what they don't do is they don't ever sugarcoat their junk. You know that? Like, they don't do it. We all know that Peter was a mess. We all know that Simon was a zealot. We all know that Matthew was a tax collector. We know that James and John had some really weird ideas about what Jesus was trying to do. We all know these guys are a mess. And Paul, like, who later becomes an apostle, Paul's right with him on this. Like, Paul has a whole, like, he has chapters about, like, what an awful person he is. You know, I was thinking about it, like, if you were to invite me to write a letter to the church that I used to pastor in Delaware. If you would invite me to write a letter to them and just say, hey, by the way, write a letter, and then we're going to share it with we'll share it with the church, we're going to read it publicly, and then we're going to pass it around to the other churches around. I got to be honest. I don't think I'd include my biggest misses. You know that? I don't think I would. I don't think I'd look back and go, well, you know something? Here's the 5 decisions that I made that I really regret. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't talk about the ways I messed up. I wouldn't talk about that. Instead, what I do is I talk about, you know something? You guys in Delaware had a pretty good pastor. He was pretty impressive, you know? Like, I mean, that shiny bald head just, like, mesmerized you. I would talk about, like, you know, I would talk about my greatest hits. I would talk about how awesome I am. I'd probably throw something in about how good they were too. I want them to feel good, right? Like, I would do this, like, but I wouldn't talk about how much I messed up. What's interesting is this. The early church does just that. Over and over and over and over again. The early church leaders don't talk about how amazing they are. They talk about their misses. They talk about the times they got it wrong. Peter is quick to share with his own disciples how much he messed things up. James is quick to share. John, as John writes, John later on is going to become the apostle of love is what we know him as. These beautiful letters that the apostle John, the guy who was like, let's call down fire from heaven, later on is writing about how we should love one another. What you see in the early church is a movement from, like, guys who really had problems and didn't understand it and were failing, and you watch what Jesus does in their lives and how they're shaped. What you don't get is a focus on Jesus getting the best and brightest people and hitching the church to these best and brightest people. What you get in the early church is a continual, over and over, consistent picture of Jesus calling the messed up and the misfits and the marginalized, and saying, let me work in and through you. The early church is not a place where we talk about how amazing the people are. The early church is a place where we talk about how messed up the early people are, but how amazing God is. And there's a big, big, big difference there. It's not about how amazing Peter was, or John was, or Bartholomew was. It's about how God takes broken people and works through them. And here's my concern. I think that sometimes what happens in 2,000 years, I think that sometimes we've got that flipped around a little bit. There's some times where, if I'll just speak for me. Maybe you can identify with this, maybe you can't, I don't know. But there's times where, without meaning to, I have these moments of thinking, well, isn't God lucky to have me on his team? Because I'm pretty special. And there's times I start to think about how wonderful I am. If I'm honest, I've met, not here, but at other churches. I've met some people like that. There's times it's easy, isn't it, to walk around and think how lucky God is to have me. Because, man, I'm pretty brilliant and amazing. The problem is, in those moments, we sometimes have those moments of aren't I amazing? Isn't God lucky? And then we wonder why God doesn't work through us the same way God worked in the early church. I think it's really simple. See, God's work in the early church is built on the fact that it's all about him and not about us. God's work in the early church is built on the fact that it's about Jesus that is lifted up. Jesus works through the brokenness, works through our mistakes and our brokenness. Jesus is the one who puts back together what we have broken apart. And none of us on our own are really all that special. I know your mom told you you're special, and she's right, you are. But the world is full of billions of special people. And none of us on our own are that special. The truth is that each and every one of us are broken. And each and every one of us are misfits. And each and every one of us have rough edges that need smoothed off. And each and every one of us need Jesus. It always amazes me when I hear someone say, well, I don't want to go to church because if I went to church, man, the roof would cave in. Yeah, that's the point. That's where we all are, right? That's where we all are. And if you're that person this morning that goes, look, I'm not good enough to be a Christian. Well, good for you. None of us are. You're in good company. Welcome to a room of misfit toys. That's us. That's where we all are. And the beauty of this, as we go through life, one of the things that we have to embrace and understand, church, is that our God is the God who doesn't call us because we're amazing. Our God is the God who says, come to me no matter how many chips you have, no matter how many rough edges you have, because I'm the one who can make it beautiful. That's what we're invited to believe. We aren't invited to think of how wonderfully gifted and talented and how amazing or how God's lucky to have us. We're invited instead to believe that our God is the God who loves us in spite of. God's the God who loves me in spite of the times I get it wrong. God's the God who works through me in spite of the mess and the mistakes that I've caused. God is the one who still wants to work in my life even when I've gotten it wrong. God is the one who invites me to reposition my life with him at the center when I've started orbiting something else. God's the one who invites me back home. This is who God is. And for some of us, we come into this place and we go, man, all you people are as messed up as I am? Yeah. And this morning, if that's where you are, welcome home. Welcome to the Isle of Misfit Toys. Welcome home to the place where we're all broken and hurting. And some of us this morning, maybe it hits a different way. For some of us, if we're honest, there might be some of us that go, you know something? I probably think of myself a little more highly than I should. For some of us this morning, maybe we just need the opportunity to stop and say, God, thank you for rescuing me. God, thank you for finding me. God, thank you for caring about me. God, thank you for investing in me. God, thank you for loving me when I wasn't worth it. God, thank you for investing in me when I wasn't worth it. God, thank you for believing me when there was no reason to believe in me. God, thank you for being willing to see past all of my faults and find me right where I am. And for some of us this morning, it might be an opportunity for us to simply pause and if I can use this word, to repent and say, God, would you help me to see myself the way you see me? Not as someone who's perfect, but someone who is broken, who you are transforming. Help me to understand it's not about how amazing I am, but it's about how amazing you are. And help me to share that story with the world.